Everybody. So last week I finished by discussing some of the kind of inherent flaws in Soviet-style communism, flaws that proliferated throughout the Eastern Bloc, right? All of these countries that are behind the so-called Iron Curtain, right? The sort of communist half of Eastern Europe following the Second World War, um, and persisting throughout what's known as the Cold War, right? This long geopolitical struggle between the West, particularly as led by the United States, and the Soviet Union, the so-called East, um, but also sort of between capitalism and democracy, um, as the West would have its system of government and economics described, and communism as the Soviet Union would. So this week I want to continue that discussion a little bit, thinking about why it was um, that Soviet communism began to crumble from the 1970s forward, but particularly in the late 1980s, and why it ultimately collapsed. And then we'll have some final thoughts for the semester about Europe since the Cold War ended, right? Europe since 1989, this period that we're still living in, right? There's a sort of new era, and it's still working itself out. So I won't have any hard conclusive ideas about this period, but a couple of sort of big picture ideas and big picture questions. Okay, so let's begin in 1961. Nikita Khrushchev, the true believer, right, true communist believer, leader of the USSR after Stalin, predicts that by 1980, the Soviet Union will have finally accomplished the dream of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? It will finally have achieved a socialist utopia that they've been working towards since 1917, that's been derailed by the Second World War, that's been challenged by the Cold War. They're actually going to get there by 1980. It's a 19-year goal. We're going to do it. This is what he says. Here's Khrushchev on the cover of Time magazine, of course. It's kind of a bizarre image. I'm not really sure what's going on here. Anyway, Khrushchev proclaims that by 1980 we'll get to this goal, right? And they're going to use a series of programs somewhat similar to those Stalinist 5-year plans. But as I talked about last week, Khrushchev's also trying to move the Soviet Union away from the intensity of Stalinism and the paranoia and the violence and the frankly mass murder of Stalinism, right? He's trying to create a slightly more humane version of Soviet communism, but once challenged by, say, revolutionaries in Hungary who want to move away from the Soviet sphere, he clamps down, he crushes them. So what he finds is, in trying to sort of open the system up, you might create dissent, you might create challenges from within, and then have to use hardline tactics, somewhat like Stalin would have, sort of put the genie back in the bottle. So this is a kind of tension, an essential tension in Soviet governance. If you try to open it up, the whole thing might collapse, right? It's sort of like a house of cards almost. Nonetheless, a lot of Soviets shared Khrushchev's dreams, and believed that they could make this happen by 1980. So this is an age of hope. This is an age of excitement in the Soviet Union. It's kind of similar to the way Americans in the post-war period felt, right? They think this is the best we've ever had it, and things are going to keep getting better now. Soviets sort of share that. But after Khrushchev's ouster in 1964 and his replacement by a guy named Leonid Brezhnev, all of this kind of hope begins to fade. And there's a general sort of gloom of disillusionment that begins to settle into life beyond the Iron Curtain. And that disillusionment never really goes away. It sort of haunts Eastern Bloc communism all the way up until its ultimate demise in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Let's talk about those Brezhnev years. This is a time of repression, right? To whatever extent Khrushchev was actually able to begin opening the society up, Brezhnev pushes back against those advancements and clamps down hard. We saw this, we talked about last week, the Prague Spring, right? The Prague Spring is a clear example. Students, artists, intellectuals in Prague and Czechoslovakia stage an uprising, and they're going to try to create socialism with a human face, as they call it. And Brezhnev marshals the Warsaw Pact countries together, and they invade their own ally, another Warsaw Pact country, and crush this uprising. So that sort of symbolizes the general style of governance that Brezhnev uses throughout the 1960s and 1970s. This period becomes known by scholars as the Zastoi time, right? Zastoi is the word for economic stagnation. Things don't continue to grow. They don't get better. Things don't change. Life sort of stagnates. It's still. And it's a time, like I said, of sort of gloomy disillusionment because things aren't getting better. So that utopia that Khrushchev predicted they'd achieve by 1980, it's not happening, right? They're not making any progress towards that goal. In fact, things seem almost to be getting worse, but if nothing else, they're not really changing. And when there is an attempt to bring about some change, Brezhnev turns to repression, often by force. Right? So here is, of course, an example that I just mentioned. Here's an image from the Prague Spring. This is an admission of weakness. Okay, that's my analysis of the Brezhnev approach to governance. The need to repress by force any protest or dissent against the system suggests that the system was inherently fragile, and that the leaders of the country understood, the leaders not only of the country but of the entire sphere, the Eastern Communist sphere, understood that small protests could ruin their stranglehold on power. And so despite what communist propaganda might proclaim, right, often the communists will say any protest, our greatest enemy is the imperialist capitalist West. They're the ones on the outside. They're the ones who are always going to be trying to attack us. They're the ones who are going to try and dismantle our society. But actually the greatest threat is within, right? It's the people that communist governments are trying very hard to control and suppress, right? Those people are sort of bubbling up, their anger is bubbling up, and Brezhnev basically only has one move, right, which is suppression. And we see in, say, East Germany, in the German Democratic Republic, right, perhaps the most repressive of all Soviet bloc states, we see intensive surveillance of the population. The government has to monitor everything everyone does at all times, because it knows that the general population is the greatest threat. Okay, so this is not a flowering of communist utopia, right? This is suspicion, it's paranoia, it's violence. It's not ideal, that's for sure. It's a time of tension. And underneath all of this is what I was talking about last week, that economic stagnation, a growing sense. So there's a growing sense that the problems of communism can't just be explained away with references to capitalist sabotage, right? There's a growing sense throughout the Zastoi period that the problems are internal, that the problems are within ourselves as the citizens of these countries begin to understand it. As you might expect, there's probably like 1,000 or more books about why the USSR collapsed. But I want to focus on 3 specific factors that seem most important. Okay, so the first cause goes back to what I was talking about last week and just mentioned those economic failures. The failures of the Brezhnev era to distribute goods where they were needed, to encourage people to work, to create some kind of incentives in the system. Those were sort of hardwired into Soviet communism, going back to Stalin and Stalin's obsessive attempts to centralize the economy and have his total control over everything that happens in the Soviet economy. And the situation just gets worse and worse. And I mentioned this last week, but we see Eastern blocs beginning to ration key commodities by the 1980s, gasoline, beef, whatever crucial commodity there could be traded in the country. These governments begin to ration them because there's just not enough to go around to meet demand. As I suggested last week, the command economies of the Eastern Bloc prioritized quantity with little consideration of demand or quality. I'll say that again. They prioritized quantity with little consideration for demand or quality, which meant there were chronic shortages, but there would also be too much of things that nobody wanted. And what goods were available were frequently shoddy. I gave an example last week of a radio factory that produces too many radios, none of which work, but there is no alternative radio that one could purchase, right? And what that means is that workers, this is sort of a simple formulation, but workers have very little incentive to try at their own jobs, right? Why would you work really hard to do better at your job if there's very little that you can do with what wages you receive, right? If there's nowhere to really put them, if the stuff you want isn't available and stuff you don't want is widely available, you're not going to really care that much about improving at your job. So we see a flourishing of the only sector of the Soviet economy that does flourish is the black market. So Western goods that are illicit, illegal, drugs, other banned substances, those sorts of things, although not necessarily widely available, there is a high demand for them, and that's sort of a growing sector of the economy. But everywhere else is stagnation. And what becomes clear by the 1970s is that this economic stagnation coincides with corruption. Okay, and this is essential because for that factory worker to have an incentive to work that's not necessarily economic, there could be like a political or social incentive, right? If you work at the factory and you know that it doesn't really matter how hard you work, you're not going to be able to do much with your wages, but you might get some other kind of social privilege. You might get some advancement in the party. You might get some special favors for your family. Then you might have more incentive. But in a society that's fundamentally corrupt politically, that incentive is gone as well. And this is a sort of twin problem of economic stagnation that we see in the 70s. And it's a second major cause of Soviet decline. Soviet citizens and leaders came to view their system as morally bankrupt, morally corrupt, and reference to the heroes of the past, to Lenin, Stalin, to Marx, the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. That's just not enough anymore to encourage people to support the system or to excuse the failures of the system, right? If you go to this shop and there's very little for you to buy, those references to Lenin and Marx are going to fall a little flat after a while. And if it persists for years and years and years, it's really going to fall flat. Think about those commodity rations, right? These only applied to common people, like the family we saw, like these two women here standing in a very short line. Even party members didn't have to ration their goods, right? So if you're a member of the Communist Party and everybody else has to go to an empty shop and see if there's literally anything there for them to buy, if you're a party member, you don't have to do that. But very few people are members of the party. Okay, in Poland, it's only about 10% of the population belongs to the party. The other 90% of the population is really left out of these privileges, and they see their own material well-being degraded in favor of that small minority of party members. So Eastern Bloc countries, despite their pretensions of challenging the class systems of capitalism, they're actually tilted in favor of a small minority. They're actually creating a new class system. And this minority then reinforces its power through repression and through censorship. Okay, so that all of that power that the Brezhnev regime seems to flex when they move tanks into Prague or something like that, that comes to symbolize the special privileges of that minority, those party members, and their concern for protecting them, as opposed to, say, moving tanks into Prague to protect the honor of the revolution, right? The general population doesn't really believe that kind of dogma anymore. So what do we see? We see dissidents, critics of these regimes are increasingly jailed. Opposition parties are outlawed. Any text that's critical of the regimes is banned. Any person who writes such a text is, of course, likely imprisoned, their family surveilled. One of the sort of interesting unintended consequences of this is that the Brezhnev era becomes a sort of golden age of Soviet dissent, Soviet and Eastern Bloc dissent, right? There are more and more people every year who can't help but criticize the system. We read last week a selection from Milovan Dilas, the Yugoslav dissident of communist inequality. In the 1970s, this guy, Václav Havel, emerges as a very well-known, highly visible dissident of the Czechoslovak government. Havel was a playwright, and his work tended to find ways that were sort of subtle to criticize communist leaders, but he did it in a way that his audiences would always understand what he was saying, even though he didn't have to say it directly, right? So he was a sort of skillful dissident. Nonetheless, by the 1970s, especially after the Prague Spring, his work is entirely banned in his home country. He's jailed repeatedly through the 1970s and into the 80s. And he becomes somewhat of a sort of romantic hero in the West. Western Europeans see Havel as a freedom fighter, right? Who happens also to be this kind of very charismatic, very artistic figure. Havel always claimed he did not want to be a dissident. Here's one of his many mugshots. He merely wanted to speak the truth. But living under a system that despised truth, this is how he put it, had turned him into a dissident, right? He was merely speaking the truth, but the system had become so corrupt that it had forced him to be a dissident, to be a critic of the regime. For Havel, the communist world was sort of upside down. Okay, an honest person under Soviet-influenced communism, in being honest, was officially branded a liar, right? And a liar who served the regime was deemed honest, right? So there was no such thing necessarily as honesty or lying as we understand these concepts. Instead, there was what the regime said was true, and there was everything else, right? And if you contradicted the regime, you were a liar, even if what you said was plainly obvious to everybody. Okay, so if you were to say, here's an example, the radio, the only radio that's available in Czechoslovakia does not work. And the factory that produces it only produces radios that don't work. Well, everybody would know this is true because everybody has the same radio. But in saying that, you could be branded a liar because you were criticizing a product of the regime, right? So it's an insane world. It's madness. It's a society, as Havel puts it, of illusions. And in his most famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, he wrote this: because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics. It pretends not to possess an omnipotent and unprincipled police apparatus. It pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to prosecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing. Okay, so this is an upside down world. And for people living under these systems, this can be incredibly disorienting because it becomes difficult to understand what is real and what is not real. And it's one thing to come to your own conclusions, but you're surrounded in your social world by people with lots of different forms of self-interest, and they might align themselves more or less with the regime depending on how that might serve their self-interest, which means in any given day you can encounter all kinds of people who have different grasps of what is basically true or not true, right? It's sort of a maddening way to live. And dissidence isn't only it's not only confined to these widely recognized figures like Dilas and Václav Havel, even though in the histories of communist dissidents, these are the people who get most of the attention, right? These are sort of romanticized figures. Any protest movement will fail if it's only one or two people, right? There's always a mass of people that you probably have never heard of who are working underneath these sort of prominent figureheads. Historians over the past few years, maybe 10 years, have been creating much more detailed and contextualized histories of dissent under communism. And they've been finding that while men like Dilas and Havel have received most of the credit, much of the organizational energy in these groups came from women. Women who were overlooked at the time and have been overlooked since, but were actually really essential to destabilizing Soviet governance, right? Consider, for example, 1969, Natalia Gorbanevskaya and Tatiana Velikanova founded the Soviet bloc's first human rights group. Women were key leaders in Czechoslovakia's first human rights group, Charter 77. Here are two of the founding members of Charter 77, all of which is to say that these were popular movements. These were sort of mass movements, even though they had to be underground. And they depended on people taking great risks, and that many of the people who took those risks have since been kind of anonymous, in particular the women who did it, in favor of more notable men who've gotten the attention. Okay, let's look at a third factor now of communist failure. And we can call this the Gorbachev factor for the final leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Like Khrushchev, like all Soviet leaders, Gorbachev was a true believer. Okay, he'd come up in the Communist Party. He'd grown up in the Communist Party. He truly believed that although the Soviet Union didn't achieve Khrushchev's goal of utopia by 1980, it could still happen. And he comes to power in 1985 with the intention of making that happen. Okay, that's going to be Gorbachev's goal. But he comes to power at a really difficult time in Soviet history. Obviously, it's the Zastoy period. It's a period of stagnation. Things are not getting better since Brezhnev has died. It's an age of political dissent, as I just mentioned. Dissent grew even more widespread after 1979, when the Soviet Union went to war in Afghanistan, a widely unpopular war. And Gorbachev believes that reform is going to be necessary, that this can be improved, this can be fixed, but there needs to be reforms. And he's kind of the man to do it, right? Gorbachev is the first Soviet leader who did not participate in the revolution in 1917, or who did not grow up in that crucial decade of the 1930s under Stalin. He was born in the 50s. He's a post-Stalinist, or he was born in the 30s, but he really only came of age in the 50s after Stalin's reign. Okay, so he represents a new Soviet generation, people who'd come up after the Second World War, after the Stalinist purges, after collectivization of agriculture. Gorbachev sets about trying to reform life in the Eastern Bloc, and he has two key watchwords: glasnost and perestroika. Those are written here at the bottom. Glasnost means openness. Perestroika means restructuring, reorganization. Soviet society, he's saying, needs to become more open, less paranoid, less suspicious, less secretive. And the Soviet economy and political system needs to be restructured. It needs to be rebuilt, right? The goal here is to make communism more productive, more energetic, more dynamic, and then to finally usher in that utopia that we've been waiting for now since 1917. This cartoon, I think, nicely captures the difficulty of Gorbachev's perestroika policy, right? You can take this thing apart, but can you put it back together? And if you do, what will it be like, right? Are you going to be able to maintain the society once you've pulled it all apart? That's going to be his challenge. So under perestroika, Gorbachev's government allows some private ownership of business, which is pretty radical for the Soviet Union. It's completely radical. The idea of private ownership runs counter to Soviet-style communism. Factories are now allowed to gauge consumer demand and produce based on that demand instead of strictly based on a centralized imposed quantity. They're allowed to sell their excess production for profit, right? So there's a profit motive suddenly in Soviet economics. This had been impossible for a long time. In short, Gorbachev's policies represent decentralization, slight decentralization of the economy, and some privatization. Okay, decentralization, privatization. If we think about this in contrast with, say, American capitalism in the 21st century, we have, compared to the Soviet Union at this time, a radically decentralized and almost entirely privatized economy. Okay, there are areas of our economy that are publicly owned, right? Say like the United States military is a really important contractor and hires private companies to do a lot of its work. That's like a public-private relationship. But for the most part, our economy is private. It's privately owned. And it's not organized by the central government, right? That's not really how we work. So moving away from the Soviet model towards something that's slightly more like what you would see in the West. You call it sort of a market-oriented socialism, but it doesn't work, right? There's bottlenecks in distribution. There's shortages. The ways that people have worked for decades are disrupted by this. No one knows to whom they should answer. Everything's sort of chaotic, and the economy begins to free fall, right? This car, now that it's been dismantled, it's not going to put itself back together, and it's not going to be able to run in this condition. So all of this restructuring, perestroika, occurs amid this opening of society, glasnost. For the first time, Soviet newspapers and publishers can discuss the history of their country. No one had ever really talked about what happened under Stalin, even though it was more than 30 years before. suddenly people do begin talking about it. They begin talking about their lives in the 1940s and 50s. Newspapers exposed problems in the society that no one had ever talked publicly about. Turns out that there's widespread alcoholism in the Soviet Union. There's widespread drug abuse, prostitution, all problems that for decades had, quote unquote, not existed, right? Going back to Havel's description of what is truth and what is not. Under these governments, it was untrue for decades that there was an alcohol problem in these countries, when in fact there was a severe alcohol problem in these countries. Um, Yet Glasnost ends up going further than Gorbachev really anticipates. And suddenly other Eastern Bloc countries, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, they ban Soviet newspapers. They say that those newspapers are too open, and these societies remain more closed, more paranoid, more secretive. They refuse to allow that information in. East Germans tended to learn about what was happening in the Soviet Union, not from Soviet news, um, but from newspapers that had been smuggled from West Germany, or from radio stations that they could pick up from the West, right? Because officially they are not allowed to learn this information. So this is chaotic politics behind the Iron Curtain, right? Chaotic flows of information. No one's sure what is officially allowed or not anymore. So by the late 1980s, we see unintended consequences of Gorbachev's reforms, right? In opening up and restructuring Soviet society, he had unintentionally exposed how useless Soviet economics had become, and how useless and absurd Soviet governance was, right? And the Soviet attempt to control what was true and not true. So there's fissures developing in the society, and these have been building in that age of economic stagnation, in that age of political dissent. But now they're too out in the open, and there's no way for these governments to begin putting things back together. All of this is happening amid an intensification of the Cold War in the 1980s. Anybody who's watched American movies from the late 70s and 1980s, or played video games, or watched sports, knows the Cold War dominated our culture at that time, right? This is an intense moment. Great fears of nuclear war, great fears of a hot war between these two powers. Ronald Reagan is the president of the United States in the 1980s. He dubs the USSR an evil empire, right? So there's and Gorbachev strikes back, right? So there's like an intensifying language, rhetoric between these powers. Yet, and this is one of the great surprises of the late 1980s, Gorbachev and Reagan, as well as British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, end up actually working quite well together. Reagan respects Gorbachev a lot, and vice versa. Gorbachev is seen as smart. He's seen as a reformer. He's seen as someone who's realistic. He can work in the real world. And a lot of this is due to Gorbachev's efforts. He's the one who really pushes. He reaches out to the West. He says, "Look, we need to address some of these problems." He wants to overcome the legacies of his predecessors. He wants to seek a reduction in tensions. And one of the great outcomes of this is a major reduction in the number of nuclear weapons for both powers. Denuclearization is the dream of Gorbachev and Reagan. It kind of sputters, I guess you could say, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it remains sort of a major global problem. But these two guys, their administrations, make a great deal of progress in that direction. As he reduces the Soviet nuclear stockpile, Gorbachev also encourages other communist countries to begin their own processes of glasnost and perestroika, right? He's reversing that old Brezhnev doctrine, which said that any socialist country that begins to move away from socialism threatens the Warsaw Pact and needs to be repressed. They need regime change. Gorbachev goes so far as to basically say everyone's on their own and no one even really needs to remain socialist. So he's moving radically away from his predecessors. What he says is what the Poles and Hungarians decide is their affair. In other words, what other Eastern Bloc countries decide for themselves is what they decide for themselves, and we're not going to interfere anymore. Gorbachev refers to Europe as a common European home, right? Soviets and Frenchmen, East Germans and West Germans, they share this continent. This is radical. After the age of the Iron Curtain, right? After carving that continent up and keeping it that way for 40 years, he's saying, maybe we don't need to be divided in this way. So it's not surprising that beginning in 1989, the nations of Eastern Europe begin drifting from Moscow's orbit, and the Eastern Bloc dissolves. Okay, in Poland, we have a group calling itself Solidarity, long an opponent of the communist regime. They are now legalized. One couldn't legally be a member of Solidarity, when for so long one could not. Soon Poland elects a non-communist prime minister, a Catholic, no less, right? Catholicism is at best tolerated and for the most part banned in communist countries. A coup topples the Romanian communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and he and his wife are shot by a firing squad. In Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel is elected president during the smoothest of all of these revolutions. It's so smooth, it's so peaceful and nonviolent that it's called the Velvet Revolution. And in East Germany, long considered the most repressive of all Eastern Bloc countries, millions of people take to the streets in the fall of 1989. And you can see this if you watch that movie Goodbye Lenin that I suggested for the extra credit. The infamous East German secret police, which had maintained its grip on power tightly for so long, which had arrested anyone who dared dissent, was unable to contain this uprising, and the GDR began to collapse. Erich Honecker, the Communist Party leader, resigns, and then, in probably the greatest symbol of this era, the Berlin Wall falls on November 9th, 1989. So what that meant when the wall fell down, and by fell down, I sort of mean symbolically. It's not like it just fell overnight, but it was opened. East Germans could now travel to the West. They didn't have to have an exit visa. In other words, they didn't need some kind of official excuse. They didn't need the government to review their excuse. The East German government wasn't really worried if these people were going to come back or not. They let them go. And so 1989 really marks the dismantlement of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And the Eastern Bloc intensifies pressure on the Soviet Union, right? What are they doing? They still exist, right? They're still a Soviet Union. But why do they exist anymore? Gorbachev's openness and restructuring had not merely changed life in the Soviet Union. They'd made it impossible for the Soviet government to rule as they long had. In November 1990, the Soviets announced that they'll allow alternative parties to the Communist Party. That's a first since 1917. And with that, the Soviet Union will soon cease to exist. By the end of 1991, the Union split into its constituent parts, 15 independent nation states, from Kazakhstan to Lithuania, to Russia, to Ukraine. Gorbachev resigned on Christmas Day 1991, and in his final speech, he proclaims the totalitarian system has been eliminated. We live in a new world, and he is absolutely right about that. And it's an interesting end to his leadership, because by the most basic metric of governance, Gorbachev has failed, right? If your government collapses under your rule, you failed, and yet he's it's hard to say that he failed. It's just that the policies he enacted led to a reality that was better in many ways than the reality that he had inherited. Um, it went where it went, and he had, I suppose, the courage and the strength to see it through, even though it meant his loss of power and the end of his country as he'd known it. There were a lot of people who grew up behind the Iron Curtain, I should say, who would not agree that it was better. Right? There's many, many, many millions of people in post-communist countries who long for those days still. It's not like there was suddenly a Western-style capitalist utopia and everybody was just happy and better off, right? There's enormous social problems in all of these countries. But by that one standard, that sort of totalitarian model of governance that Soviets had continued to exploit, in that ending, that's unquestionably a victory. What's remarkable about this post-1989, or well, I guess you could say from Gorbachev coming to power in 85 to 1991, is just how fast and how bloodlessly these revolutions proceeded. These are some of the most powerful governments in the world, and they all collapse with very little resistance. Aside from Romania, where we have a very sort of bloody version of this, none of these revolutions was violent or particularly violent. The second most powerful government of the 20th century and all of its allies simply collapsed under great popular pressure in a matter of about 24 months. It's an amazing development. And it's hard to sort of come to terms with just how significant it was, in part because it happened seamlessly almost. So the collapse of Eastern-style communism raises some huge questions. How would the West respond? Is one of the major questions, right? For 50 years, the entire period since the end of World War II, the West had really defined itself in opposition to communist Soviet governance, right? And while there's a lot of celebration in the West, right, there's a sense of having won the Cold War, there's also a great deal of trepidation. As the US President George Bush understood, I think he understood this very, very well, the conflict between East and West, for all of its problems, actually lent a lot of stability and predictability to world affairs. The West knew its enemy intensely well, and the East knew its enemy intensely well. So they were familiar with each other. They could predict one another's moves, and they had sort of, for all of their bluster and for all of their threats of violence, they had sort of worked themselves into, to some extent, an understanding. And now that understanding was lost. The 1990s, and really world affairs ever since, the end of the Soviet Union, are kind of a time of great unknowns. And observers have come to a lot of different conclusions about what that means, right? To what extent this is a good thing or not, right? The American political theorist Francis Fukuyama, this poor guy, is probably the most notorious such observer. And I'm going to drag him through the mud for a second here, and I'll say, smart guy, and he's corrected a lot of his theories. But in 1991, he proclaims that the end of the Soviet Union represents the end of history. This is a triumphant narrative. And the reason we focus on him is I think a lot of people felt this way. He represented a certain class of people in Western Europe and the United States who believed we've done it, we triumphed over them, there are no more problems. What Fukuyama meant by the end of history was ideological conflict was dead. That hundreds of years of political development, basically everything we've covered in this course, had come to an end in 1991 or in 1989, and Western style capitalism, liberal governance were going to now spread around the world, and there will only be this sort of one system. He says, we may be witnessing the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of government. Okay. The death of communism means the ultimate global triumph of liberal capitalism. This is a Darwinian claim, right? We've evolved and we've reached this final stage. And it's also an Enlightenment influenced claim, going back to the beginning of the class, right? The ideals of that Enlightenment movement 200 plus years earlier have finally taken their gestation to this ultimate climax in the 1990s. We've finally achieved what the Enlightenment had predicted. This has not happened, right? And if Fukuyama had looked in 1991 outside of the East-West paradigm, he probably could have predicted that, right? There were more forms of government in the world in the 1990s than Western liberal capitalism and Eastern Soviet communism. Think about this. There's and to a great extent, the rest of the world is dependent on these other forms of government. Western capitalist economies don't really function in the 1990s or today without very, very undemocratic and frankly not necessarily capitalist governments and economies. We have the monarchical authoritarian Saudi Arabia, right, which is sort of a keystone of the world economy today. We have the brutal one-party state of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the theocratic surveillance state of Iran, right? And Saudi Arabia and Iran remain important world powers today. And of course, there's the quasi-capitalist, but officially communist, single-party surveillance state of China. And China was not the power that it is today in 1991, but it was still a titan of global economic power. And Fukuyama is too hopeful, or was too hopeful, to imagine that any of these governments would simply make this transition to Western-style liberalism without any prompting, okay? Nor were the potential conflicts with liberalism outside of Europe, right? They remained inside of Europe as well. The breakup of communist Yugoslavia leads to a series of ethnic civil wars that last throughout the 90s, a horrific series of wars, and a genocide, an attempted ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, right? During the 1990s, Serbian Christian nationalists murdered thousands of Bosnian Muslims. So Fukuyama might think liberal internationalism has triumphed, but the 1990s are still a time of nationalism, of tribalism, of repression, of extremism. In fact, those forces increasingly dictate the development of politics and economics in post-1991 Eastern Europe itself, right? Not just in the Balkans. The clearest example of this is Russia under Vladimir Putin. By the way, Putin was in Germany when the wall came down in 1989. He was a KGB agent, a young KGB agent. And there's certain sort of Putin mythologists who say this is when his character was truly formed, when he stopped protesters from storming the office that he was in. But that's a story for another time, or one that you could look up on your own. But Putin comes to power in 2000. It's what, 2020 now, right? He's remained in power ever since. And he governs his country with completely illiberal tactics. He's a nationalist. He's aligned the state with a conservative Orthodox church. And he doesn't even necessarily run a state per se, as we understand them in the West, so much as a network of oligarchs, right? Um, Private individuals who have enriched themselves by stealing public resources. Much of that theft occurred in the 1990s. Much of their wealth has been parked overseas, so that the Russian people really don't know where it is. There's really no way to monitor how these people have gathered or have maintained their wealth other than by asking Putin himself, and I don't think he's going to say. This is not a liberal democracy, right? What followed the Soviet Union was not a liberal democracy. Instead, it's an oligarchy, it's a kleptocracy, it's an authoritarian one-party government. It just happens to be a right-wing one instead of a left-wing communist one. And just as many Stalins proliferated in the 1940s and 1950s in the Eastern Bloc, now many Putins have begun to emerge in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere. And you could argue all of this, that while all of this is true about Eastern Europe, Western Europe hasn't experienced an astonishing degree of economic and political cooperation, and that would be true, right? So if you took Fukuyama's argument and he said, yeah, okay, but let's just look at Western Europe, okay, we'll really narrow the field here. There have been impressive developments, right? This is a famous, sorry for the poor quality here, but a famous image from the French Revolution. But you can see the French flag, the tricolor, has been replaced by the flag of the European Union. The European Union in the 1990s and early 2000s matured into one of the world's great powers. It came to encompass most of the continent. Many post-Soviet countries joined the European Union. And it even adopted a single currency, the euro. Again, think back to the 1940s or the interwar period. Think back to the intense nationalist fighting on the continent of Europe. And then you move 50 years out and you say, oh my God, they share a currency. There's no greater symbol of unification and cooperation than that. But there have been limits to European cooperation, and we've seen that especially since 2016. Many French, Dutch, Germans, on and on, they fear that a common European identity is drowning out their specific national identities, right? No example of this has been clearer to any of us, right, than Brexit. One of the key engines of Brexit was this common theme in European politics now in the 21st century, European politics since 1989. The belief that wealthy Northern and Western European countries are going to be dragged down, their power will be diluted by poorer nations in Southern Europe, places like Greece. And then there's been a sort of corresponding resistance in those Southern European nations to harsh debt repayment plans imposed on them by wealthier Western and Northern European countries. So there is a lot of cooperation in the European Union. There's also a great deal of political tension, much of which takes the form of nationalism, much of it takes the form of old ethnic hatred. And another difficulty, and we talk about this in our readings this week, or we're going to read about this week and we'll talk about it in the forum, has been the changing demographics of Europe itself, right? Decolonization throughout Africa, South Asia, the Middle East led millions of people to migrate into Europe, particularly beginning in the late 60s, and then that process intensified in the 80s and 90s and has continued really apace ever since. And that has dramatically increased the Muslim population of the continent. And then these processes have been exacerbated by calamities and catastrophes in other parts of the world, right? The Syrian civil war, which has been raging for most of the past decade now, has forced more than 5 million people to seek refuge in Europe. And that's come much to the chagrin of European nationalists who say these people don't have a place in our society, or we can't afford for these people to come to our society. And that puts pressure on the European Union. How will it respond without exacerbating nationalist tensions? All of this leads to what I guess you could say is the central problem, or the central question facing Europe today, which is, what does it mean to be a European? Is the Pole as much a European as the French? Is a white French person as much or more European than someone whose parents were born in Algeria, or someone whose parents were born in Sierra Leone? Is the Serbian as much a European as the Swede, even though the Swede comes from a very wealthy northern country and the Serbian comes from a poorer southern part of the continent? Is an immigrant from Syria or India or Pakistan a European? So this question's been building, right, since the 1940s. I mean, it's truly been building ever since we began, the period we began talking about in this class in the 18th century, but it's really a 20th and 21st century question. And it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon, right? In the anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Muslim politics of modern Europe, we see a deep-seated fear among especially right-wing parties that they're losing control of their homelands. But we also see, and we see a corresponding rising popularity of reactionary nationalist parties. Exactly the kind of politics that had essentially disappeared from much of Europe since the 1940s. Have been rising back up in places like Germany, places like France and Spain. And this suggests that certain factions are willing to exploit fears of immigrants, fears of others, to build a new politics, a very illiberal politics, very much at odds with Fukuyama's tidy conclusion that liberalism is here to stay and is the only option left. Okay, that's our final lecture for the semester. Thanks for watching these all spring. And I'm, as always, excited to discuss all this material with you. Again, if you want to watch a movie for a little extra credit that deals with a lot of these problems in modern Europe, Europe since 1989, you can watch Goodbye Lenin. And let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody.